Spotlight.
This is Akashvani. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on key bills before Parliament today. The participants are Aditi Tandon, political analyst, and Niharika Bhuwania, anchor.
Good evening and welcome to today's episode of Spotlight. You're with me, Niharika, and today's conversation is all around key bills that were introduced and passed in the Parliament today. Today we have with us political analyst Aditi Tandon. Aditi, thank you so much for joining us for this discussion on Spotlight. And we have three major bills that were introduced and passed in the Parliament today, which is what today's conversation is all about.
Thank you.
So let's talk about the first bill, the Tribunals Reform Bill 2026, which was passed in the Lok Sabha today. Let's begin by talking about the major shortcomings that were there in the existing tribunal system that this current bill seeks to address. And that will also tell us the primary objective of the bill that was passed in Lok Sabha today.
Right. Niharika, the bill that was passed in Lok Sabha today is basically a legislative response to a Supreme Court order, that had come in a case in 2021. In that particular order, the Supreme Court had struck down an earlier version of the same bill, Tribunals Reform Act it was called. And the Supreme Court at that time had said in its judgment that the act impinges on the issue of separation of powers, and basically signals a high level of executive control. So the court in its order had said that a new structure should be created, and the court had only, laid down the direction and the guidance for the government that you should set up an overarching body which will be tasked with the process of selection of the chairpersons and members of 16 tribunals that exist in our country in such a way that the terms and conditions of appointments are standardized and made uniform across tribunals. Also, how the accountability mechanisms are to be set up. That particular commission should be given the power to look at that, and an independent process whereby search and selection of candidates for filling up these tribunal leadership positions should be created. This bill today basically is a response to that judgment.
Understood. So how is this proposed National Tribunals Commission going to change administration and functioning of the tribunals overall, since you mentioned that it's a response to an earlier process?
See, right now what is happening, the central government is engaged with the process of selection of candidates for filling the positions of chairpersons and members of these tribunals. You know that the central government is tasked with so many other things. So obviously there is a lag and there are vacancies, several vacancies existing across key tribunals. We have such important tribunals. We have the National Green Tribunal, we have the Income Tax Appellate Tribunals. These are tribunals which cannot afford to run on vacancies. So when you have an independent system, what it will do is, it will unburden the central government from its present position and task of selecting chairpersons, members.
Absolutely.
So now you have the National Tribunals Commission, an overarching body which will set up a search and selection committee, which then will co-opt members, including from, specific fields. For instance, if there is an NGT chairperson to be appointed, then you can co-opt an environmental expert in that search and selection committee, apart from the stated membership of that committee. So that committee will then look at the membership eligibility. Candidates will be called and interviewed, and quickly the positions will be filled. An important provision in this bill, Niharika, is that once the National Tribunals Commission makes a recommendation of appointment to the central government has to appoint within 3 months of receipt of the recommendation. So there's a time-bound period that has been specified. Idea is to cut the current lags and ensure that the commissions are at their full capacity.
Let's just put it this way, that this bill is going to unify a very fragmented ecosystem and bring in better efficiency. Let's talk about the next bill. So the Bankers' Books Evidence Bill 2026 was passed in the Lok Sabha earlier this month, and it was introduced in the Rajya Sabha today. First of all, what is the objective of this bill, and why was there a need felt to replace the previous bill which came out in 1891, so that is ideally more than a century later?
This bill that you mentioned has actually been passed by the Parliament today. Both houses have passed. Lok Sabha had passed it on Wednesday last. Today the Rajya Sabha has passed it. This bill is very important in these times of digital banking. We were so far dependent on this 1891 law, which only permits and allows manual documentation of banking systems to be admissible in a court of law. Can you imagine that digital records and virtual records that you and I have been dealing in for almost a decade now are not admissible in an Indian court right now? They will now be admissible after this bill. The primary objective of this bill is to allow the inclusion of all digital virtual records as pieces of evidence in any litigation that goes to the courts of law with respect to banking.
Understood. So this bill is much in keeping with the times and keeping in line with how the banking system has evolved to a much more digital workplace, especially also with the evolution of UPI, with the evolution of cybercrime and cyber fraud. So is this new framework also going to aid in those investigations of financial fraud, cyber fraud or money laundering cases? And is it going to bring in more efficiency?
Yeah, absolutely. Because you see, right now, most of the challenges that the central agencies or police or cyber crime units are dealing with relate to the digital space. We hear of increasing number of crimes of digital arrest. Then there are these net banking frauds that are happening. There are spam, scam, emails happening all the time. How do you deal with this new and emergent form of cybercrime without a legal framework that allows virtual and digital records to be admitted as pieces of evidence? It just can't happen. So this bill will not just strengthen the citizens because, it will cut a lot of needless, unproductive time that is spent in ensuring or procuring manual banking documents. Now everything is online. The bill even allows persons sitting at home to procure a banking certificate through a simple electronic signature of their own. So self-attestation of these certificates is allowed, and all these banking documents are now permitted as evidence and as legal documents in any matter pertaining to banking normal cases or cases of cyber fraud or any such case.
Absolutely. And it also reduces the time frame by quite a bit, and it also makes tracking of online transactions or documents much easier in that respect. So how is this new bill going to recognize electronic and digital banking records as evidence in legal proceedings, which sort of forms the crux of the matter and which was earlier not allowed or not permissible?
See, that is the principal provision of the bill, like I said. Like if you read the statement and objects of this particular bill, it basically seeks to provide for a law relating to evidence with respect to bankers' books and to align it with contemporary digital banking practices. What this bill essentially does is it expands the definition of a banking book to include digital and virtual records. Right now, a banking book in the law, 1891 law, is only defined as a manual document. So that's the key shift this bill will allow, and that will pave the way for a natural, organic, movement of digital systems and digital engagements throughout this whole banking system.
Let's also now talk about the third bill, which was introduced in Lok Sabha today, the Mines and Minerals Development and Regulation Amendment Bill 2026. Now, given the strategic importance of India's mineral resources and the ongoing discussion in the world and globally around minerals, around mineral security, so what are the principal amendments proposed in this bill that has been passed in the Lok Sabha today? And why have these become necessary with the changing times?
This Mining and Minerals Regulation Development Amendment Bill is a very, very consequential bill, if you ask me, because it basically seeks to attract private investment, accelerate exploration, enhance national capacity in critical mineral exploration, for which we are currently largely dependent on imports. So what it does is, it eases a lot of existing systems for mining leaseholders, like what is it that they can mine. For example, one of the very important provisions of this bill is that one mining lease will be allowed to cover multiple minerals. For example, what happens right now is that a mining leaseholder has to apply every time he wants to include a new mineral in his mining list. Mm-hmm. So you have to have a lease for every single mineral that you want. Right. So what this does is that a mining leaseholder will now be allowed to basically apply for inclusion of additional minerals in the existing lease. So that cuts down a lot of needless spending of money, time, and speeds up mining operations. Second very important thing that this bill does, in my opinion, is it incentivizes critical mineral mining. So what are the strategic and critical minerals that India is looking for currently? These are basically, 6: gold, silver, lithium, graphite, nickel and cobalt. Lithium, we all know, is very important for our electric vehicle
Of course.
boost, battery storage, etc. It is required in that. Right now, we are importing a lot of it. What has the government now done under the new bill is that it has proposed that all leaseholders will not have to pay any additional amount for the inclusion of these critical minerals in their existing leases. Suppose somebody is mining a different mineral which is not a part of this critical mineral list but wants to mine this. So he doesn't have to do anything extra. In the existing lease, you can add this. Otherwise, what you have to do is you have to pay extra money every time you have to include critical minerals in the mining operations. Plus, also captive mines are going to get greater freedom under this particular bill. The proposal is to remove the existing cap on the sale of minerals that are produced from captive mines. Once the owner meets his own needs through the captive mines, the remainder can be then sold. This is basically expected to improve resource utilization and also increase the supply of minerals in the domestic market, where the requirement is also rising because a lot of MSMEs are investing in mineral related industries. So these are some of the broad changes that this bill proposes.
And I believe it's also going to work on a lot of levels in terms of achieving India's objective of mineral security, reducing dependence on imports, as also ease of doing business. So let's talk about that aspect of ease of doing business vis-a-vis this bill. How is that going to be aided?
What we need to understand is that mining operations and mining rights are, largely covered and governed by the state governments. And you know that minerals are a finite, it's not an infinite resource. So there is a limited stock, and it is a national imperative that these minerals are properly mined and they are then used and deployed for the achievement of national strategic and critical goals. What has been observed of late is that a lot of states are imposing a lot of tax burdens on mining operations, mining rights. So what the government has done through this bill is, for example, one very important provision of this bill is that the central government will now take under its control the regulation of mineral-bearing lands having mineral contents in accordance with the parameters prescribed under the current law. Right now what was happening is a lot of fiscal burden was being imposed on mining operations, making the mining operations commercially unviable. So when you deregulate a little and, because every state was imposing their own level of levy, there are taxes, there are levies. So this sector was becoming very, unattractive for investors. So by this particular bill, the idea is to attract private investment, to ease, the burden on mining operations, and also on the side achieve the national strategic goals by improving the mining of critical minerals.
Absolutely. So it is going to facilitate greater participation of the private sector and improve investment in India's mining sector as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But there is also going to be a reverse effect of this in the sense of environmental safeguards. So when mining activity increases, there is likely to be a detrimental effect on the environment. How is that going to be taken care of?
See, that's a whole different dedicated landscape when we talk about development projects. Mining operations being just one of them. Infrastructure projects are another. So we already know that environmental impact assessment, which is looked after by the Environment Ministry in the country, is a very well established and resilient structure to give, clearances for all kinds of operations which come to them for clearance. So that robust mechanism operates on the site, and as we know that right now the government is working on a plan to break silos in ministries. So you have the Pragati platform on which every ministry is onboarded. So when the Mines and Minerals Ministry has a particular project to push, there'll be all kinds of ministries and the officials available on a single platform to remove the hurdles, including environmental challenges. Because we all know that environmental impact is one major challenge whenever a new development project starts. And largely if we see of late, most of the projects have been fairly rigorously reviewed before they have been, cleared.
Absolutely. And with that, we're almost at the end of today's episode of Spotlight. Many thanks, Aditi, for joining us on this episode and for giving us such a clear picture of all of these three bills. Thank you so much and looking forward to conversing with you again.
Thank you so much.
You were listening to a discussion on key bills before Parliament today. The participants were Aditi Tandon, political analyst, and Niharika Bhuwania, anchor. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of Akashvani.
Spotlight.